Edu-Magicians, welcome to the Edu-Magic Podcast with your host, Dr. Sam Fessich. Dr. Sam is a professor of education, author of Edu-Magic, and a pumpkin spice latte fan. This podcast is designed for pre-service teachers. Remember, friends, teaching doesn't begin at graduation, but during that first class at 8 a.m. Let's get this party started.
Hi, I'm Dan Kreiness, host of the Leader of Learning podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey Edu-Magicians, it's Sam, and before we start into this episode, I want to share with you about an amazing resource. It's called the Educator Candidate Member Portal. AAEE provides you with resources such as virtual job fairs, a job board, interview tips and prep, resume building, webinars. You can even get a copy of the Job Search Handbook digitally. So head on over to aaee.org and create your free Educator Candidate Member account today. Friends, one more thing before we get started. This episode is brought to you by my new course, Digital Portfolios from Scratch to Interview Ready. Head on over to sfessich.com/courses for more information about this self-paced, hands-on virtual workshop. Hello, Edu-Magicians, and welcome back to another episode of the Edu-Magic Podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Fessich, and today I have with me one of the authors of the Comprehensive Guide to Working with Student Teachers, Elizabeth Soslau. Her co-author, Monique Alexander, helped her put this book together, and I'm really excited to have her share some tips and takeaways for when it comes to working with student teachers. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. And I saw this post over on AERA's website or Facebook post, I think it was. I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to get Elizabeth on the show. As I work with student teachers and field students, you work with them as well. Before we jump into the book, can you please share about your teaching story? What do you love about education and what keeps bringing you back into the class?
So what I love about teaching is that I get to work with students when I was a middle school teacher in Philadelphia and now in the higher ed setting with undergraduates who are studying to be teachers. And what I think education is really wonderful for is understanding that students come to the classroom with power, with agency, and with ideas about who they are and what their place is in the world. And teachers get to make that space for students' voices and for students' ideas to flourish both in the classroom space and in their communities.
I love that, speaking to your why and speaking to what we get to do as higher ed professionals and working with those student teachers. I love how you said our students come to the classroom with agency and with voice. That is so true. Now, Elizabeth, would you mind taking us back a couple of years and sharing your teaching journey? What brought you into the classroom?
Sure. So actually, my undergraduate degrees were not in education. I have one bachelor's in literature and another one in corporate communications. And I ended up working for my university, which then paid for a master's degree, and decided to go into education. I had done some part-time work when I was an undergraduate at a learning center for children and really enjoyed that. I started my professional career at a charter school in Philadelphia, quickly moved to the public school system, and absolutely loved my time in Philadelphia public schools as a middle school teacher focused on English language arts. I moved into a role as a teacher coach and basically hit capacity where I realized I wanted to learn more about education and how people learn, and that brought me to exploring the doctoral program at the University of Delaware, where I earned a PhD in cognition development and instruction, always imagining I would go back to the Philadelphia public schools and back into teacher coaching. And when I got an assistantship as a graduate student working with student teachers, I realized that I actually really loved the pre-service component of teacher education compared to the in-service. I just felt pre-service teachers were very receptive, very excited, and
Yes.
interested in learning about the profession of teaching. And so instead of going back to the public schools, I ended up in higher ed with a focused clinical position working with teacher candidates.
Oh, I love that. And I love how you say that the future teachers, they have that excitement, that passion. I definitely see that as well, working with our future teachers. It is the best profession on the planet, working with student teachers, and I love welcoming them into the teaching field. Now, Elizabeth, you and Monique worked on this book, The Comprehensive Guide to Working with Student Teachers, Tools and Templates to Support Reflective Professional Growth. What was the inspiration behind writing this book, and why did you write it for today's student teacher?
Sure. So at the University of Delaware, I have done about a decade of research where I study both my own practice and the practice of other field instructors who work full-time with student teachers or teacher candidates in field placements.
Mm-hmm.
And after looking over the body of my research, I realized that each of my studies and my papers could actually become a chapter in a guide book. And there's a lot of theory and research out there about teacher education, but not so much about practical applications of how and what to do when you're working in the field with student teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I tried to do in this book with Monique was translate the theory and research that I conducted over the last decade into a practical guide for teacher educators, whether that be the mentor teacher, cooperating teacher, field instructor, field supervisor, for anyone really who works with candidates in the field.
And looking through this book, we can see that there are printables that we could use and customize for ourselves, which makes it so practical. There's tools for observation. There's debriefing conferences starters. There's conversation starters. There's how do you assess a lesson? How do you give that feedback? I think that this is a fantastic guide for our higher ed folks listening today, and then also for our student teachers too.
Yeah, it really is kind of a one-stop shopping text here for anyone who's interested in learning more about working with student teachers, or as you said, student teachers themselves to become professional and reflective practitioners.
And that's such a key part of teaching, is being a reflective educator. So let's start with some tips. We're going to start with some tips for student teachers. What are some tips that you have for that group of listeners today? What are some strategies that you have to help them out during their student teaching?
Sure. And obviously all the tips I'll share today are much more expanded upon in the text itself.
Of course.
But I'll give you some sound bites here. So first, I really want student teachers or teacher candidates to not blindly mimic their mentor teacher or their cooperating teacher. Oftentimes we see teacher candidates just parroting what they see their classroom teacher do in the field without deeply understanding why their mentor teacher does what they do. So really ask your mentor teacher questions, find out why they make the decisions they make. You can learn so much more about teaching if you really understand the invisible thinking behind what makes your teacher do what it is they do in the classroom. So that's the first tip. My second tip is when lesson planning, really take time to do your own research. Some of you will teach in practicum classrooms where you'll have a teacher's guide or a script that you're supposed to follow. But it's really much more meaningful if you learn about the community where you are teaching, learn about resources available to you and to the school children, and really seek out alternative materials and instructional approaches that are a best fit and a match for the children in front of you. I always say to my own candidates, the textbook authors never met the children you are teaching. You are the one who knows the children you're teaching, and you should make instructional decisions based on that understanding of the children. Third, don't buy the myth that teachers are born. Teachers aren't born. Teachers are taught and learn how to teach. Teaching's a set of skills that can be rehearsed, practiced, and learned over time. Also, oftentimes I hear my mentor teachers tell my candidates, of course you'll get better with more experience. More experience doesn't make you better. If that was true, every veteran teacher on the planet would be the most excellent teacher you've ever met. And we've all met veteran teachers who still have a lot to learn. So experience in and of itself doesn't make you better. What makes you better is systematic reflection on your experience. So you're exploring what you've learned from your own teaching over time and making incremental improvements as you move forward. And finally, and this goes back to what I was saying about lesson planning, get to know your students deeply. Learn about their prior lived experiences. It's really important you understand you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't connect with kids that you don't respect or you don't love.
Absolutely. Relationships first, first and
Absolutely.
foremost. Yes. If I can just press upon the lesson plan idea and thinking through your own research, doing your own research, getting to know your students, creating lessons that are tailored just for them. That is so critical. What are some resources that you suggest your teacher candidates use when developing their lesson plan?
Sure. So we have a chapter in the book. It's around this concept of culturally responsive teaching. And so we encourage our candidates to do both a community walk where they move around the neighborhood of the children to learn about community resources and aspects of the community that can help inform their lesson planning. We also share a couple of resources in the text. There's Learning for Justice, there's Facing Ourselves, Facing History, and the Multicultural Ed Pavilion, which are 3 websites where teachers can go, and our pre-service teachers are encouraged to go and find lesson plan ideas, resources, materials that really cater to the individuals in their classroom. They'll look at resources around student identity, whether it's cultural identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, and they can really get a lot of lesson planning resources to cater their instruction to the students that are in front of them. Those
That's
are all resources
excellent.
we provide in the text.
That's excellent. That's awesome. You're right. It really is a one-stop shop. So my next question is, we can kind of take it in 2 different ways, however you would like to do it. What are some tips that you have? Because we talked about this being a one-stop shop for student teachers, for mentor or cooperating teachers, and then also for our higher ed, our college supervisors. What are some tips you have for the supervisors or the mentor teachers that'll be working with our lovely student teachers?
Right. So these tips are really, just like you said, for any teacher educator. So anyone in the position of working with an undergraduate who is trying to learn the art of teaching. So we have, the first one is exploring and analyzing pupil work with the teacher candidate after they teach, and really using the pupil work to judge whether or not the lesson went well. Often we have mentor teachers, cooperating teachers, field supervisors sitting with their candidate after a lesson to debrief, and they start with the question, how do you think it went? And really that question is a horrible setup to the candidate. Because if the candidate says it went well, and then you ask them why, they say, well, I got the lesson done in time, or the kids seem to have fun. Those aren't really great pieces of evidence or data to judge whether the lesson was successful. So we want the judgment on the lesson to actually be rooted in whether the kids learned something or not. And the only way to judge the success of a lesson is to really explore either the pupil work or the observations of the pupils during the actual lesson. So that's the real question to answer. Did the kids learn something? Not did you get done in time, or did the kids seem excited? Both of those things are great, but they're not sufficient to judge whether a lesson went well or not. The next tip is to help the teacher candidate feel a sense of belonging in the classroom, in the school. So it's really important that mentor teachers invite candidates to lunch, to PLC meetings, to informal gatherings, to introduce the candidate to colleagues. Oftentimes, the field instructor or the university supervisor will help broker those conversations and broker those meetings. But we've learned from the research that a sense of belonging in the classroom community and in the school itself is instrumental for the student teacher to really learn what it feels like to be a classroom teacher. We also
Absolutely.
want classroom teachers and mentor teachers to meet frequently and informally with the teacher candidate to give feedback, ask questions, provide support. Many times our mentor teachers think they need to sit with their candidate for like an hour session once a week. But what we found from the research is touching base before and after the lesson, or even huddling up during a lesson to adjust the lesson on the fly, really helps the candidate learn from their teaching in incremental ways, much better than waiting until you have an hour to capture together. We also want both and we write about this in the book quite a lot. We want the mentor teacher, as well as the university field instructor supervisor to push back on any university requirements that suggest that you give scores, numerical scores to candidates after they teach a lesson. We know from the research that these scores actually do not promote reflective practice and can actually damage professional relationships between the teacher educator and the candidate. So we want you to give lots and lots of written feedback, narrative feedback, and verbal feedback. Candidates really translate those scores into grades, and they see it as a finalized comment about their professional prowess, as opposed to information that can further their own growth and reflective practice. And then finally, do your best to let go. We're not out here in the business of creating mini-me's. I don't want my candidates to teach like I taught. I don't want my candidates to teach like their cooperating teacher. I want my candidates to come up with new ideas and approaches for planning, classroom management, instruction, and assessment, and bring ideas from their cutting edge methods courses that they've had back on campus into the classroom space. So that means that clinical educators and mentor teachers really need to make space for the candidate to experiment and balance, as a teacher educator, balance your need to control by only stepping in when the candidate is in danger of harming pupils' emotional well-being. That is the only time a teacher educator should step in and stop a candidate from experimenting. So it's a real balancing act there.
Those tips, like you had mentioned, are great for our cooperating teachers, mentor teachers, and our college supervisors. And just, thinking about some of the questions that we ask our teacher candidates after an observation lesson, thinking about those relationships between the university supervisor and the mentor teacher. This book is full of techniques and strategies to get us started. If you are a new professor going into a field type experience class, this book has so much in it to help us out, even our veteran higher ed professionals too, to think about how do we change that script for conferencing? How do we give them feedback that's meaningful, that they can really be a reflective educator and understand the why behind the art of teaching? So, Elizabeth, we're going to end out our conversation today. Where can my audience grab a copy of your book, and how can they connect with you?
Sure. So, Monique and my book is available on Amazon, as every other book in the world is available online. You can also go to Teachers College Press and order the book. They have lots of different promotions, free shipping. Sometimes they have percentages off. So those are the two main places, Amazon and Teachers College Press. If you want to connect with us, we actually both of us love talking to educators. We also provide professional development around the books. So Monique and I can come out to your university setting, train your field instructors or your adjunct instructors or anyone who does the field work, as well as we do work in the K-12 area with classroom teachers who are going to serve as mentor teachers. And we actually have a series of workshops coming up for principals and assistant principals to learn how to create contexts that really allow both their mentor teachers and their candidates flourish. So you can email me at esoslau@udel.edu. Both Monique and I have Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts. You can just search us by our names, and you will always get a response from us.
Beautiful. And I'll put the link to your email and your social media in our show notes as well. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for stopping by and sharing all about the book, Comprehensive Guide at Working with Student Teachers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And there you have it, EduMagicians. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. For more EduMagic, check out sfessage.com and follow Dr. Sam on Twitter and Instagram @sfessage. Until next time, you have the EduMagic within you.